Welcome to This Week on the Hill, where we take you beyond the headlines of the political discourse to bring you insights directly from the heart of Capitol Hill, unraveling the complexities of the Republic's most pressing issues. Thanks for joining us as we embark on this journey behind the marbled columns on the Hill. I'm your host, Tony Perkins. Well, this week on the Hill, there were plenty of opportunities for contrast between Republicans and Democrats. National Police Week provided one of them.
Let's talk top Democrats in the House who, just a few years back, were all on board with defunding the police. And we told them at that time, and we remind them again today, that that's a fool's errand. You cannot defund the people who keep your communities safe, obviously. But they did it anyway. They said it anyway. And in some of these communities, they actually went forward with that policy. And that's the places around the country where you have the greatest levels of crime.
That was House Speaker Mike Johnson making remarks regarding National Police Week. The House Speaker will join us later. Another topic of contrast on the Hill this week is support for the ability of Israel, which celebrated its 76th anniversary, to defend itself and secure its future.
We cannot continue into the future by having Hamas retake Gaza. It's not only would be a tremendous victory for Hamas, it would be a tremendous victory for the Iran terror axis, because Iran is trying to envelop us with a noose of death, of which Hamas is one component.
That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on CNBC this week. Well, prior to passing the Israel Security Assistance Support Act on Thursday, Speaker Johnson made the contrast on Israel very clear.
This is not complicated. It's actually very simple. This is a moment where we need, not just the American people, but the entire world need moral clarity. You are either with Israel or you are not. And if Schumer refuses to bring this up for a vote, he'll be telling the world that his party, the Democrats, are no longer willing to stand with our great ally.
We'll talk about that with House Speaker Mike Johnson. With the sentencing of peaceful pro-life protesters 1 to 57 months in prison, the weaponization of the federal government was a topic on the Hill this week.
5 years in jail under a FACE Act federal prosecution? That is extraordinary. I mean, does anybody care about what's happening to the weaponization of government against the people?
That was Texas Congressman Chip Roy on the House floor. And we are less than 2 weeks away from the World Health Assembly meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where the World Health Organization is seeking what has been described as a global power grab. Now, the British government has stated they will not sign the proposed documents. Why? Because they have looked at what's in them.
We know from the drafts that have been submitted in recent months what the real agenda of the WHO is. They want to have binding powers over national governments to introduce all sorts of restrictive measures on our citizens. They want to be able to direct the health budgets of member states. They want to introduce global digital health passports and other measures. And this is the organisation that aspires, in the words that are still in the draft treaty that we have, to be, and I quote, the directing and coordinating authority on international health work, including pandemic prevention and response.
That was Danny Kruger, a member of the British Parliament earlier this week. The Biden administration, where do they stand? Well, they're all in. The question is, can they be stopped? We'll talk with New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith, the senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Also, the Reverend Billy Graham was honored on the Hill this week. All of that and more coming up on this edition of This Week on the Hill.
Today's edition of This Week on the Hill is brought to you in part by Americans for Prosperity and by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens.
Joining me now is Congressman Chris Smith, a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He is co-chair of the House Pro-Life Caucus and the Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism. Congressman Smith is also the chairman of the Subcommittee on Global Health, Human Rights, and International Organizations. He's one of the most knowledgeable members of Congress when it comes to the United Nations and the WHO. He represents the 4th Congressional District of New Jersey. Congressman Smith, welcome to This Week on the Hill.
Thank you so much, Tony, and appreciate all of your great work every single day. Thank you so much.
I want to ask you about this. The World Health Assembly will begin meeting on May the 27th, and the focus will be on two documents, a global pandemic treaty, or accord as they are calling it, and changes to the international health regulations. You're concerned about both. Tell us why.
Well, there's no doubt, and I've read each of the drafts because they keep rewriting it, but it's pretty much the same essence, about sovereignty, that the unelected bureaucrats at the WHO, World Health Organization, will dictate a health emergency and will tell us that we must, by treaty obligation, in other words, a binding, just as if Congress passed a law, we've got to provide up to 20% of all of our vaccines and everything else to them. That's our foreign aid. If we want to decide to do that in Congress, well, that's a decision that should be left up to the people's representatives. They will have the ability to just take it, and that's part of why the UK is so against this, because they will be dictating to us, and we've had two press conferences on this, and you were at one of them, and I deeply appreciate all of the work you've done. But they made it very clear that they're going to have unbelievable, unprecedented power over health. Many of our attorneys generals in general in the United States have written and said, this is a matter for their states. You can't impose upon our states, and I would equally say upon the U.S. government, a mandate from abroad, coming from Geneva, which is where the WHO is located, what we can and cannot do. If a 2-year-old is told by the WHO that they have to get a vaccine, like we saw during, many people were promoting that during COVID-19, that was utterly absurd and counterindicated by all the best medical science. There's also the idea that disparate voices who are in opposition to some of these ideas will be snuffed out. It'll be one monolithic, do whatever the crowd tells you to do. And again, that crowd will be located in Geneva. I went over there about a month and a half ago, Tony, and spent time lobbying people at the WHO. And for some, they see it as a money grab, that they'll just be getting more resources from the United States. And here's one of the dirty secrets. The actual amount that we will owe, because there will be an obligation, billions, will not be decided until after the WHO has agreed to. And
so we will essentially we'll be giving them a blank check.
Blank check. And let me also say, the dirty little secret, again, that the administration wants to use is called an executive agreement, where they will not submit it to the United States Senate for advice and consent. In other words, a supermajority would have to support it. We do have legislation pending, and I do think that bill has to come up. And 49 of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate, every one of them, have written saying, they are not. This has to be submitted to the Senate. Left to its devices, the Biden administration will simply, like they did with the nuclear deal with Iran, like they did with the global warming Paris Accord, just sign an executive agreement, and he alone will have the ability to bind us through a binding treaty. So it's a treaty.
The legislation is, Congressman Tiffany has this legislation that would require it be submitted to the Senate for ratification. And folks, if you want to weigh in on that, just text WHO to 67742, WHO to 67742. Congressman Smith, you brought up a number of issues related to this. One was the censoring, which we saw the Biden administration doing, working with social media during COVID-19. But I want to ask you this. The British government, which is much further down the road of socialism than America is, they've said no. This is an issue of national sovereignty. You mentioned being forced to put 20% of their resources into the global response. They've said no to this. Are you surprised by that?
I am surprised, and pleasantly so. I think they have looked at this and they do see that it's a transference of their rightful authority as the House of Commons and the British government, just like our authority should not be usurped, again, by unelected bureaucrats. I've known I just wrote them a letter with WTO with multiple signers about how they're violating their own process in rushing this to completion. And I think they're doing it in part because they want to. They don't know where we're going to be in the next election in the United States. So therefore, they want to get that executive agreement agreed to by Biden. But I was pleasantly surprised by them. And there's also things that are hooked into this. They call it essential health services. and that means abortion according to the WHO. What is that doing in a pandemic treaty? It is a all-out effort, like an octopus, to bring in things that the woke agenda wants. And Tedros, let's not forget, I've known him for 30 years. He's the Director General of the WHO. He was absolutely disingenuous, I believe a liar when it came to COVID-19. He got his job from Xi Jinping in China. That's how he got the job. He was their candidate, and he whitewashed everything that was happening in those early weeks and months of COVID.
Congressman, 20 seconds left, but do you fear that this is the nose of the camel under the tent, that this is a pursuit of one world government?
I think that argument can be made, and made, I think, persuasively. Well, we've got to keep power in the states and in our Congress, where people are elected. If people don't like how we vote or how we articulate the issues, they can throw us out. You can't throw out Tedros and somebody else who will then tell us and dictate to us. Very dangerous. And it's about time.
Congressman Chris Smith, Congressman, we got to go. Thanks for joining us, as always.
Thank you very much, Tony.
This is Amy, working mom, feeling the pressure of rising costs.
Feels like every day is getting more expensive.
We get it. The cost of living today is way too high. That's where we come in. At Americans for Prosperity, we offer solutions to the country's biggest problems.
Like making life more affordable?
Yep. That's why AFP launched Prosperity is Possible, the nation's largest movement to tackle the cost of living crisis.
Welcome back to This Week on the Hill. I'm your host, Tony Perkins, and I'm joined now by House Speaker Mike Johnson. Mr. Speaker, welcome.
Hey, Tony. Great to be with you, as always.
All right. This week was National Police Week. In fact, this past Saturday, 282 law enforcement officers who died in the line of duty were honored during the 36th annual Candlelight Vigil on the National Mall. Now, coinciding with this week's focus on law enforcement, you led congressional Republicans in advancing a law and order platform that appears to sharply contrast with the policies of President Biden and his party.
Well, that's true. Of course, everyone knows, we don't have to remind them, over the last several years that the Democrat Party on a national and even local level have gone to great lengths to defund the police, and they passed anti-police legislation at the local and state, and even attempted at the federal level. We've been pushing back on that. Of course, our party, the Republican Party, stands strongly with law enforcement. We always back the blue. We always have. We always will. And so I think our legislative priorities this week were a signal again that's what we stand for. And we passed some important measures to support our law enforcement. You know, it's a job that a small number of people are called to do. We know from Scripture, I'm often reminded about, for example, the 13th chapter of Romans that says that the civil authorities and by extension law enforcement who keep law and order are called God's agents of wrath to bring punishment upon the wrongdoer. You know, some people are called to pastoral ministry, Tony, some to music ministry, others to law enforcement ministry, and you have a background in that yourself, so you know very well what we're discussing here.
Well, let me ask you this question, Mr. Speaker. Do you see this as one of those contrasting issues going into the fall's election?
I do. I think that, there's a very important principle in play here. Do we stand for the rule of law? And you see that being undermined and diminished in so many ways. And this is a long cumulative effect. It has been a strategy, a political strategy, shockingly, of the Democrat Party for the last several years to turn on those who protect our communities. It never made any sense to us. I just thought it was obviously morally wrong and politically foolish, but that's the strategy they pursued. Well, now we see the completely foreseeable effects of defunding police, of de-emphasizing law enforcement, of in some respects, demonizing those who put on a badge. And now people are in full retreat. Now you see the liberal, progressive Democrat mayors in some of these major cities trying to quickly rush in and restore their police departments because they recognize now it leads to chaos. And that is not what the American people need or deserve.
So, Mr. Speaker, let's go beyond the streets where state and local law enforcement officers do their job. And as you mentioned, I've I was a police officer for about 10 years. I have two of my children in law enforcement now. Let's talk about the two-tiered system of justice that has emerged in this country that is ideologically driven. Is that not what you witnessed this week in New York City when you attended the trial of former President Trump?
It certainly is. Donald Trump is being targeted because of who he is. If he was not running for president again, I don't think you'd see any of this barrage of prosecutions, these local district attorneys and state attorneys who are after him. Even the federal Department of Justice is after him through special counsel Jack Smith. They have targeted him because he is soon to be officially the nominee of the Republican Party for president. And this is their only way to stop him. I think they assessed that some time back. And so everybody around the country can see this for what it is. Anybody who looks at what is happening objectively has to reach the same conclusion. They are targeting him because of who he is. And the real threat to this, Tony, is it is the weaponization of our system of justice itself. And as I explained in that presser outside the courthouse in Manhattan yesterday or earlier this week, look, you have to understand this is something that would undermine a very foundational principle of our country. The people have to trust that the justice system is fair, that there really is equal justice under law. And if we don't have that, we lose something very important to maintain a constitutional republic.
The former president says it's not just about him, but it's what he represents, the people that he represents, the fact that he has stood up to the left, to the media, that's the reason he is the target.
I think that's right. I think he symbolizes a pushing back against that federal corruption and the deep state and the bureaucracy and all the things that frustrate the American people. They see in Donald Trump someone who is unafraid to sort of crash through those barriers in a certain respect. And I think that's why he is such a threat to them, and that's why they pulled out all the stops. But what they're doing here really is a travesty of justice, and I think we're right to call it out and to point out this is not who we are in America. It's wrong. I think he'll endure all of this. But what they've done, I mean, look at it very practically speaking. He's in this was his 5th week of trial in Manhattan on this charge, a crime that they can't even adequately define, that prosecutors passed on bringing these charges 8 years ago. They did it now for political reasons. And they kept him off the campaign trail. Think of it, for 5 weeks, except for a couple of exceptions. He's been stuck in a courtroom in Manhattan and not out talking to voters. That's exactly what was the whole objective here. And they have more trials now that they're trying to schedule and to keep him tied up all the way through November if they can.
For the benefit of our viewers and listeners, I should mention that you are a constitutional attorney. You've argued in many, many federal courts across the country on issues, so you know a little bit about the law. But for those that might want to dismiss, well, this is President Trump, you're just saying that because it's Trump. I want to talk about this weaponization, because this week, a pro-life activist, Lauren Handy, was sentenced to 57 months in prison, nearly 5 years for peacefully protesting outside a D.C. abortion clinic. Now, Handy was charged by the Biden Justice Department for violating the 1994 Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, which they began enforcing aggressively after the overturn of Roe. Is this not an example of that weaponization that you talked about?
Completely. It's an upside down, instance of priorities being exactly in the wrong place. They're aggressively prosecuting people who are exercising their First Amendment freedom to talk about the sanctity of human life on a public sidewalk. And meanwhile, they catch and release dangerous criminals, persons who come across the border illegally, and people who are violent offenders multiple times over. These district attorneys and even the federal Department of Justice have turned a blind eye to so much of that. And yet they're targeting people that have a different political viewpoint. I just think it's such a blatant example of exactly what we're talking about. And the people see this. They see a two-tiered system of justice, and that's a real threat to us. Because if people, Tony, at the end of the day, if people see that this is what is going on, they lose their faith in the justice system itself. And then they just determine, you know what, what's the point? I'll resolve my disputes on my own. I mean, that's how you lead into chaos, and that's how you lose a culture, and that's what's happening right now.
That sounds very similar to something we read in the book of Judges, where every man did what was right in his own eyes.
That's right. That's exactly right. There's a lot of things that read prophetically for what we're facing right now.
I mean, when we lose confidence in government, or we have no credible leadership, people do take matters into their own hands. And you're right, it leads to chaos, but then that leads to, repression and political and cultural chaos.
Well, correct. I mean, if you lose the rule of law, if you lose the foundational underpinnings of a constitutional republic, what you ultimately result with, again, is a return to tyranny, because the people who are in charge abuse their authority, and we know that power corrupts, and as Lord Acton observed, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Right. You have to have all these checks and balances, you have to have the separation of powers, and you have to have the maintenance of law and order.
All right, Mr. Speaker, hold that thought. We're going to come back and finish this conversation. Folks, stick with us. More this week on the Hill. As another critical election approaches, it's not only about casting your vote, it's about elevating your voice. As AMAC's membership grows, Washington listens. If you love America, visit amac.us/Salem to become a 4-year member for just $30. Membership gives you access to the AMAC magazine, money-saving discounts, and more. By joining the over 2 million members, they can't ignore your voice. Join now at amac.us/Salem. That's amac.us/Salem. Welcome back to This Week on the Hill. I'm your host, Tony Perkins. You can keep up with me at T. Perkins on X. We're joined by House Speaker Mike Johnson discussing Law Enforcement Week. Mr. Speaker, before we move to international issues, one final question for you on this issue of law enforcement. We see the left consistently pushing for greater federal control over local law enforcement. Given what we've seen with the weaponization of the federal government, federal law enforcement, is that a direction we should be going?
No, it's not. We believe in the principles of federalism and of course, states' rights, and that very often law enforcement is best handled at the local or state level, obviously. You need the officers who are closest to their community to be able to make those tough decisions and serve and protect in the way that they deem appropriate. You do not need bureaucrats in Washington dictating to law enforcement around the country everything they should be doing. That micromanagement, I think, could be a dangerous thing, and I think it's something we ought to oppose.
So let's move to international issues. Let's just discuss this growing divide between the U.S. and Israel under the Biden administration. I mean, it appears that it's widening.
Well, it does. And speaking of micromanagement, that's exactly what is happening here. Joe Biden is turning his back on Israel and trying to dictate to the prime minister there, Netanyahu, and his team how to prosecute the war, how to defend themselves. He's trying to micromanage their effort there, and that is completely counterproductive, and it's also dangerous. And he's doing this, Tony. I mean, I think it's patently clear to everyone that President Biden is changing his tune and turning away from Israel because he has a Michigan problem, he has a Nevada problem, he has a large contingency of Arab voters in his party, and some now what we call the pro-Hamas wing of the Democratic Party, who are demanding that he not be friendly to Israel, that he not assist them. And you see it manifested, for example, in his latest efforts to stall the delivery of really important weapons and munitions that Congress has voted to send. The president is now intervening in that and trying to stop it, apparently. So this is it could have catastrophic consequences for our dear friend and close ally, the only stable democracy in the Middle East, at the worst possible time. As we know, Israel is fighting for its very survival, and Joe Biden is playing politics, and we are calling it out for what it is.
Are you concerned that there's even greater danger here than just withholding some munitions, that this is sending a message emboldening Israel's enemies like Iran?
I certainly think that is true. And Iran, of course, Hamas and Hezbollah and the others are proxies of Iran. Iran is the primary opponent. And of course, they fired directly on Israel within the last month, as we all know. This is very serious business. And what Israel needs and what the world needs to see is a strong America that is resolute, that we are on the right side, that we call evil what it is, This is, as Benjamin Netanyahu said in the days following the October 7th barbaric attack on his nation by Hamas, he said this is good versus evil, light versus darkness, civilization versus barbarism. We had better be on the right side of that. And it is deeply concerning to us that the commander-in-chief here in the United States is equivocated. And he's appeasing Iran and criticizing Israel. All of this should be exactly the opposite, and we're calling on him to do that.
So, Mr. Speaker, how do you process that from, we were talking a moment ago about law enforcement, talking about biblical perspective of law and order. How do you process our foreign policy positions and how we are to stand with Israel from that biblical perspective?
Well, of course, for many of us, I mean, put aside geopolitical stability issues and the politics of it. I mean, for many of us, it is an article of faith. I mean, it goes all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, where it says very clearly that, God will bless the nation that blesses Israel and curse the nation that curses Israel. We want to always be on the right side of that. But even if you put the biblical admonition aside, it makes every bit of sense for us to stand strong with Israel. I mentioned the only stable democracy in the Middle East. That area is a tinderbox, as you know, and you have radical Islamist terrorists and warring nations all around Israel. We have to maintain that relationship. And I think it's a bipartisan concern. I mean, I think that there are many Democrats here, of course, and virtually every Republican who understands the necessity of this. I just wish that Joe Biden would remember it. I don't think he does. I think he's making decisions right now that are in what he deems to be his political interest to save his office. And that is the wrong calculation to be making at a time when the world is quite literally on fire because he himself is projecting weakness on the world stage. We're not maintaining peace through strength right now. We're doing the opposite. Right.
And I think when America's strong, we keep those tyrants and terrorists at bay. We keep them, we check their activity. All right, Mr. Speaker, we're up against a break. We're going to come back, continuing our conversation on the international front. We're going to talk about the World Health Assembly, which will be meeting later this month in Geneva, Switzerland. All right, folks, you can email us thisweekonthehill.com. Stick with us. We're back after this.
Across the country, men and women are working with Americans for Prosperity to reignite the American dream. We've shared some of their stories with you, but they aren't the only success stories we've seen. Americans for Prosperity partners with millions at the local, state, and national level to improve people's lives. Everyday Americans, supported by AFP to advocate for common sense solutions. 4 million strong, and with local offices in every corner of the country, you can become a part of something bigger than politics as usual.
Welcome back to This Week on the Hill. I'm your host, Tony Perkins, joined by House Speaker Mike Johnson. All right, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the World Health Organization, which is a part of the United Nations. On May the 27th, the World Health Assembly will be meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, to advance 2 documents, the International Health Regulations and the Global Pandemic Accord, or Treaty, both of which will centralize and increase the power of the WHO. Now, this is an entity that got everything wrong in COVID-19, but now they want to basically wanting to etch in stone everything that they did that was wrong.
Yeah, it's a crazy idea. It's one that we are resisting in every way possible and in demanding that we not be a part of that. The WHO, to your point, was a by some respects, a culprit in what happened and how terrible COVID was. They missed it. And the idea that we would confer or transfer to them the power over how to handle such a situation is just unconscionable to us. And it has to be resisted. We don't cede power to any international organization, certainly in times of emergency. Talk about the separation of powers. That's a central theme in our discussion this morning. We don't do that. That's not what we do in the U.S. We're the leader of the free world. We can make our decisions on our own, and we do not need some international organization of bureaucrats dictating to us how to handle emergencies. We're not on board with this idea.
Now, what we see once again, the Biden administration wanting to circumvent the legislature, the Congress on this, the Senate. This is, by all purposes, a treaty, but they're calling it an accord. and there's evidence to suggest that there's collaboration with the World Health Organization to avoid the ratification process. Now, there's legislation that is in the House that would say this has to be submitted to the Senate for ratification before the United States would become a party to this. Of course, the obvious outcome would be they couldn't get the authorization because of the problems with this, the attacks on sovereignty, the attacks on freedom of speech, privacy, international travel restrictions, vaccine passports. Do you see that legislation moving forward?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, I would hope there'd be bipartisan support for that. You would wish that in a scenario like this, you would have a president, commander in chief, who would just wave this off and not show any interest in it at all. But it's necessary for Congress to step in, I think, in a time like this. And so I think you'll see a big wave of support for a measure like that. We've been talking about this, warning against it for some time, and now it comes to a head. So I expect that Congress will step in and let their voices be heard here.
Yeah, to just hope that the administration is listening. Suggestions are probably not. Another one of those big issues, by the way, folks, if you'd like to weigh in on that, you can text WHO to 67742. That's WHO to 67742 and weigh in on that. Another issue, Mr. Speaker, that I think sets up a contrast between Republicans and Democrats, Title IX. Big issue last week on the Hill, where women's sports, women's spaces, and education now under assault by the leftist agenda of the Biden administration.
Yes, that's true, and it has been, and it's a big issue to people around the country. My team calculated I've been in 102 cities in over half the states over the last few months, Tony, moving around doing events. And this is a big issue to people. I mean, from the East Coast to the West Coast, north to south, they're really concerned about the assault on women's sports, about the safety of young women and girls who are playing in athletics. And certainly on the college campuses, this has become a big issue. And I just think it's one that resonates with the people because we know that some things are inherently wrong. And the idea that, some elements in the Democratic Party and the progressives would be pushing this in the name of equality or whatever their supposed agenda is just madness. And we need to call it out as such. We need to protect our women and girls sports. And I think there's a very important initiative for Congress to weigh in on as well.
Are we at a tipping point when you look at all of these issues we've been talking about, the demonization of law enforcement, weaponization of the federal government, the consolidation and really the surrendering of power to United Nations organizations like the World Health Organization, which the Biden administration is pushing for, women's sports? Are we at a tipping point? Has the left overreached?
I believe they have. I think the pendulum has been pushed so far to the extreme left that it's beginning to swing back, because I think most Americans, I still believe, Tony, we're a center-right nation. Most people can apply common sense, and most people still recognize that there is a right and a wrong, in spite of the fact that the progressive left has been trying to convince us for decades now that there are no moral absolutes. People understand that there are. And I think that you're seeing a backlash. It's a welcome backlash. I think it is a tipping point. I think we're going to be able to move that pendulum back to common sense. It'll be gradual, but there are more and more voices raising up at the grassroots level and even in top posts of leadership who say enough is enough. We have to call a spade, and that's what we're doing now.
What should the American people, what should our viewers and listeners be doing to add their voice to that choir?
Get engaged. I mean, this is a most critical time. We are fighting right now for the very future, the very survival of our imperiled republic. You know, Tony, we turned 248 years old as a nation on July 4th, and there's no guarantee, when you and I have discussed this many times over the years, there's no guarantee that this grand experiment in self-governance that we have here, this great blessing that God has given us, there's no guarantee that it can endure. You have to fight for it, and you have to defend it, and you have to teach the principles to the next generation, or they'll lose it. You know, Reagan famously said that observe that freedom is not inherited in the bloodstream. What he meant by that, he used to explain, is that this is an ongoing activity that all of us have to engage in. So let your voice be heard, get involved in political campaigns on a local, state, federal level, and get involved and get your church and your synagogue, activated. Now is the time to speak up. Now is the time to let our voices be heard and to share the truth with others, because people desperately need to hear it.
Yeah, as you said, you and I have talked about these things many times over the years. Reminded of Ben Franklin emerging from the Constitutional Convention. What form of government do we have? A republic, if you can keep it. And this republic was made not for spectators, but for participants. And we must all do our part to make a difference and to preserve it. All right, Mr. Speaker, we're up against a break. We're going to come back and wrap up the program. We're going to talk about the Reverend Billy Graham. Some positive news on Capitol Hill this week. All right, folks, you can contact us and ask us a question thisweekonthehill.com. Also, if you want to track me on X, it's @TPerkins. Don't go away. We're back after this. Welcome back to This Week on the Hill. I'm your host, Tony Perkins. To find out more or to submit a question or topic, go to thisweekonthehill.com. And again, if you want to keep up with me on Twitter, or X as it's now called, @TPerkins. Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for spending time with us today. But there's some, good news. We're talking about all these things happening. We've been on the Hill, the issues. We've been talking about faith. We've been talking about the Bible and how that influences how we live. It has a strong influence on our nation, even though we may be losing some of that. And this week on the Hill, there was a special dedication service, the unveiling of a statue for the Reverend Billy Graham. Tell us about it.
Yes, one that we very much enjoyed. As you know, in Statuary Hall, there are two statues for every state. Every state is allowed two statues of a great former person who came from that state. And North Carolina, after many years of effort, has switched out their historic statue, and they brought the Reverend Billy Graham to Statuary Hall. It's a grand piece of art, but a very symbolic one. He is one of only 4 Americans in the history of our country, Tony, that received the 3 honors: the Congressional Gold Medal. He lied in state after his passing, and now he has a statue in Stat Hall. Really important thing. He ministered, as you and I both know, to hundreds of millions of people. We'll never know this side of heaven how many lives he affected for eternity. But what I pointed out in my speech as emceeing that event at the unveiling of the statue is that I have a personal connection. He began his first crusades in my hometown of Shreveport, Louisiana in 1951. And he, over the course of a couple of weeks, he preached the gospel to over 200,000 people in Northwest Louisiana at that event. So we all have a connection. We all feel a connection to Billy Graham. And now he's memorialized here in the Capitol for everyone to see every day as they walk through.
This also speaks to that fundamental role that Christianity, the Christian faith, has in our country. I mean, you can't deny it. It's there.
Well, that's certainly true. We're a Judeo-Christian country. We're built upon biblical foundations and principles. It's articulated from the very beginning. Those principles in the Declaration of Independence, our nation's birth certificate, and it carries on through today. We quote Reagan a lot. He had a way of summarizing things concisely, and he said, always remember this. If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, we will be a nation gone under. And all the things we talked about on this program today, there's a central theme to all of it, and that is that we have to hold fast to our foundations and our moorings. And Billy Graham was a great voice in that regard. He walked with kings. He advised presidents for generations, Republican and Democrat. But at the same time, he was a humble servant of the king, and he walked with the lowly and the poor, and he just lived out the gospel, and that's one of the greatest things about him and his legacy that we get to honor here now every day.
It's an example for all of us. Mr. Speaker, thanks so much for joining us today, for taking a look at what's been happening on the Hill this week.
You got it. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate you.
All right, we'll see you next week. And folks, I want to thank you for joining us for This Week on the Hill. I encourage you to tune in again next week as we take a look at what's been happening on the Hill. Have a blessed weekend.